Hello, and welcome to Word on the Reef, a podcast where we take the plunge into one of the world's most spectacular natural wonders, the Great Barrier Reef. Today, we're back at beautiful Heron Island to learn about one of the world's most incredible animals, the humpback whale. Every winter, whales migrate from the cold Southern Ocean to the warm, protected waters of the Great Barrier Reef to give birth to calves. From June to September, the reef is teeming with whale activity. As we sit on the beach, we can see humpback whales breaching and tail slapping in the distance. They're too far away for us to swim to them, but as we don our snorkeling equipment and slip into the water, something incredible happens. The sounds you are hearing were recorded by me in the waters of the southern Great Barrier Reef. These haunting calls, clicks, and rumbles continue for weeks, especially towards the end of the season. A continuous symphony of whale song that can be heard ringing out through the ocean for miles. To some Aboriginal tribes, songs of whales are believed to carry spiritual messages. Some interpret these songs as a form of communication between the spiritual and physical worlds. If you listen carefully, what do you think they're saying? Many First Nations groups along the coast have creation stories involving whales. In some traditions, whales are seen as ancestors or creator beings who have helped to shape the land and sea. Some groups hold ceremonies to honour whales and celebrate their arrival in winter, involving dancing, singing, and storytelling. Whales also frequently appear in Aboriginal art, including rock paintings, bark paintings, and carvings. The Irukandji people of far north Queensland regard whales as totem animals, with whom some individuals have a spiritual connection and a responsibility to protect. They also use whale behaviours as seasonal indicators, marking the arrival of specific fish species and changes in the weather. I'd like to acknowledge the 70 different traditional owner groups whose sea country makes up the Great Barrier Reef, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, we're catching up with whale expert, Dr. Olaf Meynecke. Olaf grew up with a love of nature in his homeland of Germany, but when he did his marine science PhD at Griffith University in the Gold Coast in Queensland, he became hooked on surfing, diving and snorkeling. He fell in love with the marine life that the area has to offer, and in particular, whales. He has been studying humpback whales for the last 12 years, in particular, the impacts they're experiencing from climate change. But he's also recorded whales doing all kinds of weird stuff, like rolling in sand and putting seaweed wigs on their heads. And he runs his own whale research and protection organisation called Humpbacks and High Risers on the Gold Coast.
Good evening, Olaf. With all the time you have spent in the ocean with whales, you must have seen some pretty incredible things. Can you tell us some of the highlights and some of the most exciting experiences that stick out in your memory?
I guess some of the highlights and the most sort of memorable encounters I had with marine mammals and whales in particular. I love the interaction, in particular when it's obviously voluntarily and the animals are actually approaching us humans. And that's like some of the nicest sort of experiences. And for instance, being out and swimming or not actually swimming, hanging on a line and experiencing close encounters with minke whales, with dwarf minke whales in the Great Barrier Reef was something so special. And I did that for a couple of years. I helped running tours out of Cairns, and it was something I'll never forget because you have to have the patience to just be there quietly on the surface of the ocean and wait for these whales to approach you. And then they get, closer and closer, and eventually sometimes they're just like less than a meter away from you, and you've got these 7-8 meter animals just passing by like spaceships, and it's just wow. And then look at you and you look into their eyes, and it's just like trying to build up this connection, and that there is so much more that we can learn from these animals. So, and of course, encounters with the species that I'm studying with humpback whales, where I've been able to just be on a boat and have really close encounters where the whales were approaching the vessel and they're actually doing spy hops. They're looking at us. They're trying to figure out what we are, and they're literally doing people watching. So that kind of these kind of moments are just outstanding. Like literally a few weeks ago, we were doing a research trip and we've been with two whales, and they've been with us with the boat for more than 8 hours nonstop. So it tells us also that there is a mutual interest when the animals are in that moment where they can feel that they can or want to interact and they want to come close. And so it's not always just the humans, chasing the whales for close interaction.
Wow, that's so cool. So tell us a bit about whales. How many types of whales are there?
There is some confusion about, what kind of whales are out there, because often, when we hear about strandings, like, for instance, pilot whale strandings that are making the headlines in the news, and then people think there are whales. I mean, they're actually toothed whales, so there are dolphins in the sense that they are related to dolphins and not actually the baleen whales that we kind of distinguish from from these dolphins that actually have teeth to hunt. And they are really different in their social behavior and the way they are obviously getting their prey compared to baleen whales. So baleen whales really just have a plate of baleen, like a filter, that helps them to filter out fish, but also just krill, so plankton. And that also requires them to have a very different strategy of survival. They can do solitary feeding. They can gulp in, a density of prey like krill, and they don't actually have to actively chase it. So chasing isn't really a thing for baleen whales. They have to be really good in knowing where the highest density of prey is, and then make a conscious decision about how best to get it. And so, whereas when you look at the toothed whales, they need to work together. So thinking about trying to grab a fish with your hands, and then even trying to grab a fish with your mouth, it'd be impossible to do that. And of course, it's impossible for a dolphin as well. They're marine mammals. They're mammals like us. So they have to work together to actually chase fish. And then that sort of, working together means they have to form relationships and bonds that are lifelong bonds. And they also have a strong sort of family relationship. They stay with the family for life if they can, because that enhances their survival chances. So really different, these two kind of, the toothed whales and then the baleen whales.
So your main type of whale that you study has been the baleen whales, and especially the humpback whales. They're pretty famous in Australia. A lot of people, including me, have been out to go whale watching, and often that happens in winter when they have their migration. So can you tell us a bit about where these whales live, where they come from, and why they migrate past the coast of Australia?
So humpback whales are indeed probably one of the most well-known baleen whale species that we have, because they're traveling close to the shoreline and people often see them. And of course, they are also the most abundant one of all the baleen whales. Well, minke whales are equally abundant, but they don't travel as close to the shoreline. So people are, in the last couple of years, they're more and more likely to see them. And of course, they are also a great species for whale watching, because they're surface active and they're doing a lot of breaches and tail slaps and so on. And so that, makes them a prime target for whale watching around the world. And interestingly enough, basically, humpback whales occupy every ocean on this planet. So there are a generalist species that has managed to basically occupy all oceans and also have different prey, go for fish, go for krill, and that makes them, in some way unique, but they're generalists. So when we think about whales or talk about whales, we actually most people will talk about humpback whales because that's what they've seen. And so it's sort of like the go-to species, basically. And they have recovered quite well, as I said before, so there's quite a lot of them out there.
One of the reasons why humpback whales travel up the coast of Australia and into the Great Barrier Reef is for reproducing. Is that right?
So indeed, the reef plays a major role to provide protective waters for the humpback whales and the so-called E1 population, which is the one on the east coast of Australia. They use the Great Barrier Reef as a breeding area. And there is still some uncertainty about where exactly they're mostly calving. There is some estimations that it's very likely in the Bunker region, which is the southern GVR, exactly where we are right now. This is the hotspot for most of the calves being born here, but there is now also a shift where we see calves being born further south, New South Wales, southeast Queensland. So there is a bit of shift happening, but the whales will come up here, even if we're pretty sure they do, even if they have given birth further south, they still come up here to actually nurture the calves and ensure that they grow fast, because they need the warm waters that makes them grow faster, and they need the calm waters, and the reef provides perfect conditions, calm conditions.
Yeah, and I know that we do see humpback whales as far north as Cairns and maybe even a little further north, and it makes sense that a young baby would want to have an easy start to life before they head back down to the freezing cold Antarctic waters. What can you tell us about whale communication? They are famous for singing. I've heard them singing underwater. What does all this singing mean?
For humans, vision is almost the most important sensory system to understand the surroundings and the environment. Whereas if you are a marine mammal, if you're in the ocean, vision does not really matter, because that's helpful for a few meters, but other than that, there is not much to see other than blue, wide open ocean, or it's pretty murky and you don't see anything. So sound is the way of communicating. It's the way of making sure that you know where your mates are, where your baby is, to make sure what others are doing and tell them what to do next if they're hunting together. And that's the case for the dolphins, for the toothed whales, that's the case for the baleen whales. They all heavily rely on sound, on vocalization. And there is a specialty about humpback whales that they are actually, well, mostly the males, and it's the males that do the songs. So they can do 10, 15, sometimes 20-minute long songs that are a continuous sequence of different frequencies, and they are individual, so they have very individual song lines, and they change them every year. So it's a unique feature, and it's different to birds, who often just repeat the same vocals over and over again. Whereas the humpback whales, they have those variations and the changes and individual signatures. So you could actually identify individuals. We haven't quite, cracked that code yet, but further down the track, hopefully we can. So this makes the vocalization so fascinating. And of course, when you are putting your head in the water during the whale season here on the east coast of Australia, you're very likely to hear some of the whales singing or just vocalizing. They're not necessarily singing, but they're communicating with each other. And it's a fascinating, beautiful experience, because it gives you this feeling of not being alone in this wide open ocean. And I remember when I go diving or swimming, once the whale season is over and I do not hear any of those calls, I feel like someone left me, and it's just so lonely out there.
That's so beautiful. And apparently whales can hear noises or communicate over hundreds or maybe even thousands of kilometers. So that's really amazing. And also different pods of whales might have different languages. So maybe a humpback whale from one part of the world can't communicate with a humpback whale from another part of the world. Do you know if that's true?
Well, we think that they can communicate across populations. They would have frequencies there is frequencies that are quite similar, and they used, between populations, likely in very similar ways. But as I mentioned before, there's these distinct, songs that are different. But I'm sure that, if another male from another population hears this, they know it is a song. They just don't necessarily know who it is because they've never met this individual. But there is, for toothed whales, there is actually, and for instance, orcas, they develop such specialized communication within their group that some of the others, if they have never spent time with that group, they don't understand the meaning of this communication. So it's like a slang. It's like you would go to, another place in the same country. They're still speaking that language, but you won't be able to understand it because they have the worst slang ever. So it would take you some time to actually figure out what it means. So there's culture that these different pods develop, and I'm pretty sure that humpback whales have a bit of the same, or at least developed cultures, but because they're so open to every other individual, they mix all the time. There's a lot more mixing going on. I think there is, not that sort of specific language that each of the populations developed.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I think apparently one thing that happens with dolphins or orcas that are put in captivity, they try to put them with another friend to keep them company, but they can't understand each other or get along if they don't come from the same pod. So that's why it's quite sad for them. Luckily for the humpbacks, I don't think they can be kept in captivity. And I just think that was incredible what you said before, that they can sing their own beautiful, unique song that goes for 15 or 20 minutes. I mean, it just shows such a high level, a different type of intelligence than what humans have, because no man has ever sung me a song that he made up, which lasted for 20 minutes. I don't know if I want anyone to, but it would be quite a difficult feat. What can whales do in terms of defense? I mean, they're pretty big, but do they have predators, like in terms of natural predators, in terms of like sharks? And what sort of behavior do they use when they see themselves or their baby under attack?
So they do have predators, natural predators, and it's mostly orcas. So they are probably the most dangerous predator they have. And it also depends on the region and what kind of orcas are in the area. So some orcas have specialized on humpback whale calves, or calves in general, baleen whales, and they have developed a technique basically.
Those
because it's
murderous animals, aren't they?
They're not.
I mean, they're remarkable, obviously.
Yes. So they do have a strategy to basically drown the calf. That's how it works. So they separate it from the mom, and then the technique is that two or so grab the tail, and then at least another one is trying to grab the top and keep them under the water as long as possible. That sounds all terrible and horrible, but it is absolutely fascinating if you think about how much communication is required, how much, evolve of techniques to make this hunt successful. And on the west coast of Australia, I know they're quite successful doing this. On the east coast, we don't seem to have as many cases. And there's only recently was seen some documentation of orcas actively preying on humpback whales on the east coast. So the technique, or the survival technique for the humpback whale, is that they will use their tail, their fluke, and that's the strongest muscle, their peduncle, to defend themselves. And they will flip around orca easily. They can actually throw it up in the air. And they've been seen to do this in Monterey Bay in the US and other places. So they will actively defend. But of course, if there's multiple orcas and they have a good technique, then they can separate the calf. They won't attack a healthy whale, and a shark will never attack a healthy whale. But of course, if a whale is unwell and it's starting to swim slow, it becomes an easy prey for sharks. And orcas are probably going to be a bit more picky. They won't necessarily go for a thick animal. They are quite picky when it comes to their food. But sharks are not. So we've seen some calves with shark bites, so that sort of shows that obviously, sometimes sharks, if they do see the opportunity, they will try and go for it, but their success rate must be very low. We don't think it's a very high chance, unless the calf is absolutely newborn and is unable to actually, stay on the surface for long. So these are the two sort of, predators, and defense is usually tail and pushing or throwing the predator away. And of course, avoidance is the other strategy. So they will hear orca calls from the distance. If they do hear it, they will go silent. They will go and leave the area as quickly as possible. Because obviously, that's the best strategy, just to avoid those predators.
Wow, amazing. So I guess that's why anyone swimming with whales has to be really respectful of their space, not only to protect the whales, to protect yourself from a tail slap or something. Don't go near any animals' babies is probably a good piece of advice. You mentioned that whales are so intelligent and so curious, they'll come up and check you out if they feel like it. Sometimes you hear about whales or different animals coming up to humans for help if they've got lines entangled on them. Is there any other contexts where whales interact with humans? Like, have whales ever tried to rescue humans that were drowning or anything like? Any good stories around that?
I mean, I'm not aware of any stories where a whale has actually rescued a person, but definitely something that is very interesting about humpback whales. They seem to have this altruistic behavior where they are helping other species when they are in danger. So they've been helping seals, and particularly when orcas are trying to attack them. They have also been defending off, the orcas when they're attacking baby gray whales. So it's quite interesting that no one really knows what the actual reason for that is, because they are putting themselves in danger, but they are quite, determined to protect other species from these dangers, and that is. It's pretty unique. There's not many species that do that, and that people know of that do this. So it's a wonderful and really interesting behavior to study, of course. And we also know that they are helping each other. So I had, as an example, an entanglement a couple of weeks ago where we assisted, and it was, for me, the first time I was actually there to assist with an entanglement, and I had the drone up and I was able to see that there were two support whales. One whale was keeping eye contact with the entangled animal that was really badly entangled. It had chain over its eye. It was bleeding everywhere. It was absolutely horrible scene. One was keeping eye contact and swimming next to it, and another one was just below it, to give it some support, to be able to be on the surface when it needs to be and needs to breathe. And I saw that is fascinating to see. And we find this behavior when there is, in particular, calves entangled, and they must give out a distress call. And then multiple whales come to the side, and they will stay there and try to assist. Of course, they don't have hands. They can't actually do much. It must be terrible because they can't unwrap the calf, but they're trying to at least lift it up to the surface and be there to help as much as they can.
Wow, that is so lovely. I can see why you love these animals so much. They're honestly the best people.
Yes.
We could learn a lot from them. And what about breaching? That's one of the most fascinating behaviors of whales, is jumping up out of the water and doing things on the surface that humans can see. Why do they do this?
There is indeed multiple species of whales that breach. The humpback whales are probably the one that breaches the most. They have
Show-offs.
They really show off with it, and they have made a specialty out of this behavior. It's something that over the years I could see it's a hello. So basically one whale breaches, and a few kilometers in the distance another whale will breach, and it signals that there are presence in the area, and it also basically tells them the size. So it's all about the sound wave that travels underwater. It's nothing to do with what we see on the surface. They're not actually doing it to be seen. It's about the splash in the water and the displacement of the water that creates a massive sound wave. And the bigger you are, of course, the bigger the whale, the bigger the sound wave. And if, likely will provide a response by another whale, or, they will respond to it. And then we also have seen it almost as a goodbye. So when a pod has interacted, whales have interacted with each other, then before they part, they're breaching again, and then they part. So it's a usually very positive behavior. Well, we've also seen it whales doing it before a boat approaches quickly, because they know that's how they are seen better. So that's a way for them to be seen. They also use other splashes or so to signal that they are there, so that the boat slows down. So they must have learned already that if they're doing the surface activity, that it's more likely a boat will actually slow down. But yeah, for them, it's a communication, and a positive one, to signal that they're in the area and that they're happy to engage.
Have you found any other sort of strange or puzzling behavior from humpback whales that you've studied? Like, was it you that was telling me about them sort of wrapping themselves in seaweed, or like doing other strange things that you've studied?
Yeah, so we've discovered a few things. One being sand rolling. We tagged a couple of whales on the east coast of Australia, and we found that some of those tagged individuals were actually rolling in the sand. And it was not just the whale that had the camera, it was also other whales. It was filming other whales doing the same behavior. And it was quite fascinating to see, and a lot of skin came off. So the theory behind it is that they are shedding, and it will help them to remove some of that excess skin. And there was also fish picking off that skin, that excess skin. So it was quite a unique behavior to see. But then there's been anecdotal reports, and there has been other scientists at least talking about this before. So it must be something that is, not unusual. They might do it wherever there is suitable sand. And then the other study we did was looking into how these whales are using, or humpback whales are using kelp, and that they actually play with the kelp, they put it on their head, and where they put it, so that they're actually, having this unique interaction with kelp. And it's not just humpback whales, also grey whales, northern right whales, southern right whales, range of species that are doing this. But it's a really awesome behavior to watch, and people have sent in drone footage that we've studied. So it was just about learning what this behavior might be, and how long the interaction lasts, and where the animals are placing the kelp, and what kind of kelp they're using.
Wow, it kind of sounds like they're playing and doing it for fun, which is really cute. So unfortunately, the humpback whale has been hunted throughout history. Some of the earliest European visitors to Australia and New Zealand waters were whaling ships. So can you tell us a bit about the impacts of the whaling industry on humpback whales?
Whaling, of course, was absolutely devastating for humpback whales, but also for other baleen whales. They have been reduced to a fraction of their original population, in some cases around 1%. And of course, that genetically had an impact. That means they've lost some of their, basically some of their gene pool, just wiped out. And that, is a problem when there is shifts are happening in the ocean environment, or they have to come up with new strategies or change, then that gene pool has been wiped out. And humpback whales have been doing well because they recovered quite quickly, yes, but they are also, as I call them, the rabbit of the baleen whales. They can have a calf every year if conditions are absolutely perfect, and they can really reproduce quickly. And they're also not quite picky with the kind of food that they're getting. They can have fish or krill. So that makes them not as vulnerable to shift and changes that we are experiencing at the moment. So the recovery is good, but then we don't really know what the next 5 to 10 years are holding for the humpback whales. And we do know from other species like grey whales, they're not doing very well, but they're very specialized. And so the specialized ones, they are obviously not recovering, or if they have recovered, they are suffering much more from current changes than like Meynecke whales or the humpback whales. At the moment, we're still looking at a good and healthy recovered population of humpback whales, and we need a lot more monitoring. We need a lot more understanding about the influence of climate change, but also other stressors, and what the population is actually doing on a seasonal basis. And unfortunately, in Australia, the last time there was a proper census done was in 2014. And I think, this is almost 10 years ago. So there's a lot of things that's changed in the last 10 years.
Mm. Yeah, it's really good to know that the humpback whales have rebounded since the international whaling ban in 1986. Um, we know there's still some countries that are exploiting loopholes in the whaling ban and continuing to kill whales as well. Can you tell us a bit about how this is able to continue happening?
There are unfortunately still a number of countries that are engaged in whaling, and there's, well, three developed nations that are active whaling nations, and then there's a couple of nations that are doing it for subsistence or traditional reasons. And it is something that is still actually on the agenda. It's in the International Whaling Commission. There's still other nations, not just those three developed nations, that are calling for hunting whales again in the future. There is, the issue of the ethical issue, like how do you kill a whale humanely? I don't like to use the word humanely because humans are not really well known to kill things in a good way. But it's something that obviously isn't working. You can't really kill these animals quickly. So that's one problem. But then, of course, the other problem is that we've seen some of the population shifts in the last couple of years, for instance, gray whales, but we've also seen high stranding numbers in North America for humpback whales. So it is way too early to say that we can start hunting these animals again and not risking their massive decline. And so there is no real ground for, arguing to continue or start whaling again. Those argumentations, I think, are just based on, a belief system, false belief system, or belief systems that are just, from the past and they need to be changed. And then also, an ignorance towards the fact that we can't just kill those predators, basically apex predators, that take so long, like decades, to actually build up populations. That's for all kind of, sustainable food. I mean, we really have to fully shift away from those animals that are taking way too long to reproduce. We can't really hunt them because it's just, it's just really not good to maintain sustainable populations.
And besides hunting by humans, there's some other key threats that whales are now facing, like plastics, climate change, and ocean noise pollution. Can you tell us a bit about some of these threats?
So there's multiple threats now. Whaling was pretty much an easy one because you could have just, we could have well predicted that if we stop whaling, we stop killing whales, there's a good chance that they can recover and that they will hopefully, return back to their original population size. But now we've got multiple stressors that all work together and they can be quite lethal, but we can't simply address them with one change. So we're talking about noise pollution, we're talking about entanglement in fishing gear, talking about the pollution of the ocean in general, with plastic, but also with persistent organic pollutants, with chemicals that are in the ocean that accumulate in the whale's tissue that make them sick over days, weeks, years, and so on. And so, and then there comes the problem of climate change that can shift where food sources are and make the life of the whales really difficult. So I think the key to understand what the future for whales will hold is to understand how these threats are linked and how we can address some of those threats, locally and effectively, and some of the threats like climate change, obviously we have to address on a global scale. But at least we can implement, the effects of climate change in future conservation plans and the management of protection of baleen whales in the future, which currently is not in place. We have very little, idea of what is going to happen with humpback whales, for instance, in the future with climate change.
The impact of climate change on whales is an area that you've been looking at a lot. Can you tell us a bit more about how climate change impacts whales?
Yeah, so in our research group, the Whales and Climate program, we're studying the impacts of climate change on humpback whales. We're focused on the southern hemisphere. At the moment, we've got amazing researchers across the southern hemisphere here in Australia, but also in South Africa and in South America. And we're looking at different populations and how these humpback whale populations are impacted, or how they're changing with ocean dynamics, with shift in prey, and what their responses are. We already know that they're adapting. They're adapting on all oceans, and they're adapting in different ways. They're finding new food sources. They're developing new feeding strategies. They're changing their migration timing. All of this is very hard to actually capture in data because it happens on a global scale, and it's different from population to population. And so what we're seeing is that, the whales are capable, the humpback whales at least, are capable of changing their behavior to adapt to, for instance, warmer waters, or most importantly, to where food is or isn't. And they can, take on new feeding areas and actually start feeding there. So that is what's happening. And that's actually then, interestingly, causing new problems. For instance, great example, the west coast of the US, humpback whales and other baleen whales started feeding close to shore. And that is in an area where there's a lot of crab fishing happening. So they actually had to change, or did change, the regulation for the crab fisheries to reduce some of the entanglements that are coming, that start to play a role now because the whales are feeding in the same area. And I think, this is exactly where that whole idea of we need to think ahead and need to understand, okay, if these animals are adapting, then we need to make sure that they're not faced with other stressors like fishing and noise and pollution, so that they can at least thrive in those regions where there's alternative food sources.
I'm interested in the subject of noise pollution as well, because whales obviously are very sensitive to noise, and that's how I communicate. So I understand that sometimes when whales have stranded themselves, when autopsies were done, some of them have issues with their ears, and maybe that has something to do with why they got lost or stranded themselves. Do you think that's a problem to do with noise pollution?
Not so much for the humpback whales. So the noise pollution, of course, is a problem for humpback whales because they are vocalizing, they are communicating via different sound frequencies. And if there is engine noise, or if there's, sound or noise frequencies in the same level, it will mask their communication. And then they have to either change where they are, or they have to increase the frequency to be able to communicate. So that can, I compare it usually with someone being in a nightclub and, you're talking to your friends and it's all fun, but then the next morning you're absolutely exhausted, because you've been your voice is rough, or you can't even hardly speak. It's because you actually use a lot more energy to communicate, and you also have to concentrate more. So there is that impact on the energy for the animals. And so that's definitely something where we think that, the humpback whales are impacted by noise. And then the avoidance of an area because it's too noisy, that's also an impact because they are using energy to go somewhere else that's not necessarily better for them. If we're, talking about some of those injuries in toothed whale ears, like pilot whales, then these can be injuries that are caused by high frequencies. And that's usually also the frequencies in which the toothed whales are communicating. Navy sonar is an example of that, and it can really injure some of these dolphins in, within a few hundred meters, or depending on the strength, of course, of the source. And then the issue there is also not necessarily always a direct injury, but making that communication amongst them really difficult for hunting. And it's loud. I mean, there is a constant sound level in many places in the ocean now. So if they completely rely on hunting, and it's fine-tuned, they are We're looking at pilot whales, for instance. They hunt in 1,000-meter depths. It's supposed to be absolutely quiet. They're the only ones who are making sound down there. And it's absolutely fine-tuned to the perfection that they can get their sonar working to identify a small squid. And that's like an object that doesn't even have much hard substrate in it, right? So I think, this is where the noise pollution really plays a role, and we underestimate it completely because we don't understand what sound in the ocean means. It's completely different to what sound means in air, like blasting a radio or whatever. It's very different in the ocean. If you blast a sound in the ocean, it spreads everywhere. There's no borders. It means it goes everywhere. And the frequencies can be, so strong that they be carried for hundreds of kilometers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what can we as people and as a society do to protect our beautiful whales?
There's a few things we can do. If you are living near the ocean, you might be lucky and there is an organization that does citizen science, and you can participate in whale surveys and help with monitoring whales. There might also be some campaigns. There's always campaigns, for instance, to stop some of the threats that the whales are currently facing. Put your name down and support these campaigns if you can. Sometimes it's just a click. Might not make much of a difference, you think, but it does, because if thousands or hundreds of thousands of people do it, the campaigners will love you and they can do something with it. And then, of course, if you do have a little bit of spare money, you can donate to local organizations. I always recommend to donate to local organizations where it's a local impact. It might not look or sound big, but those people on the ground often have very little administrative costs, but they are doing most of the work and they can change things for an area. And think about, hundreds of organizations doing this, then you have an impact on a global scale. You can go to a beach cleanup and also talk to like-minded people. You can inform yourself about what are the problems for whales in your area, and how can you advocate, or just talk about it with your friends or family members, just to spread the word and raise awareness. That is the key. And I guess, to cite one of my favorite scientists, Dr. Sylvia Earle, the biggest threat to the ocean is the ignorance. So if you do have knowledge, you will probably care for the ocean much more than if you just keep ignoring, this beautiful environment.
Absolutely. So anyone that's taking the time to listen to a podcast is already onto a win. Before we finish up, can you tell us a bit about the organisation that you run, Humpbacks and High Rises?
Yes, of course. So my organization is called Humpbacks and High Rises because we started off on the Gold Coast in southeast Queensland, Australia, and there's a lot of high rises. And I was seeing humpback whales next to the high rises, and I thought, this is a bit of a unique thing. There's this big city growing, and there's these beautiful animals, these fifth largest animals on the planet, just right next to this city, and it's such a contrast. So, having like humpbacks and high rises, that was the idea behind it. And of course, people can observe the whales from the high rises. So that was the other thing, getting people to actually help with surveying whales from the high rises, from their apartments. And we sort of operate in southeast Queensland for 13 years now. It's been a bumpy but successful journey. We've got a few hundred volunteers, and it's a joy to work with like-minded people. Small NGO, and a bit of grassroots, but we've achieved a few things, so I'm quite proud of it. Well, we are a Mission Blue Hope spot, and we've put a Gold Coast Bay on the map, on the global map of areas that need and are developing further protection. We have also published a wide range of papers and established the region as a resting area for humpback whales. We've documented population changes and shifts. We've documented the number of calves increasing in our area and the need to reduce boating speed and protect these animals better in the hotspots that we have. So we also have run a wide range of events. We've set up the first whale festival that the Gold Coast has ever seen, and still run it for the 5th year now. So communicating with people, networking with other organizations to achieve change for our region.
Amazing. Well done with that. It sounds like an amazing project. So thank you so much for your time today, Olaf. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and I've learned so much about whales today. Do you have an Instagram page, a website, or anything like that where people can follow your adventures and find out more about protecting whales?
Absolutely. There is just our webpage, so that's www.hhr.org.au, and you can also just send us an email to info@hhr.org.au. And yes, I really enjoyed that chat with you. Thanks so much. I always like talking about whales, obviously, and I hope if you listen to this that you enjoyed and learned a little bit about the whales.
I hope you enjoyed our chat with Dr. Olaf Meynecke today. Olaf has asked me to add that there is currently a petition available online asking the Queensland Fisheries Minister to stop whale entanglements in shark nets, which he says are a huge problem in Australia and are totally preventable and unnecessary. For more information and to sign the petition, visit change.org and search for the keyword whale. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe and follow Word on the Reef on Instagram to get notified when it's time for our next adventure. This is a not-for-profit passion project, so if you enjoyed it, please write a review, share, and tell your friends. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please consider becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month over at patreon.com/wordonthereefpodcast. You'll get a shout out, and the proceeds will help towards covering costs like podcast hosting, email hosting, editing software subscriptions, and so on. That's all for now. Best fishes, and see you next time.